This was supposed to be a lost battle, but they won. They marched into northern France, outnumbered and exhausted. England's King Henry V faced a much larger French army. Mud, fatigue, and fear weighed down the English troops. Victory looked impossible. This was the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, a clash that would go down in history as one of the most improbable military victories ever. So, how did a bedraggled, sick, and starving army manage to defeat a force that was, by some estimates, 6 times its size? Let's dive into the incredible story of the Battle of Agincourt. Our story begins in the autumn of 1415. King Henry V of England had just successfully captured the port of Harfleur after a brutal, 5-week siege. But the victory came at a great cost. His army was decimated, not by fighting, but by dysentery. They called it the Bloody Flux, and it was tearing through his camp. With his men sick and the campaign season ending, Henry made a controversial decision. Instead of sailing home directly from Harfleur, he decided to march his army overland to the English-held port of Calais. It was a risky move, a show of defiance meant to prove his right to the French throne. The march was a grueling 260-mile trek through hostile territory. The English army, now only about 6,000 to 9,000 strong, was a shadow of its former self. Most of them were archers, lightly armored, and already exhausted from the siege. Their supplies were low, the autumn rains were relentless, and the French were shadowing their every move. The French, meanwhile, were mobilizing. They had gathered a massive army, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 36,000 men. Led by the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, their forces were fresh, well-equipped, and filled with the flower of French nobility, heavily armored knights eager for glory. The French plan was simple: block Henry's path to Calais and force him into a battle he couldn't possibly win. They succeeded in cutting him off at the River Somme, forcing the English to march further inland, buying the French even more time to assemble their forces. Finally, on October 24th, the English army found their path blocked. Near the castle of Agincourt, the massive French army had drawn up its battle lines, straddling the road to Calais. There was no escape. Henry's exhausted men looked across the field at the glittering sea of French banners and polished steel. The French were so confident of victory that they reportedly brought carts to haul away the anticipated English prisoners. That night, the mood in the two camps couldn't have been more different. The French camp was a scene of celebration. The nobles were feasting, gambling, and arguing over who would get the best ransom from the English lords they were sure to capture. They were loud, arrogant, and utterly convinced of their impending triumph. Across the field, the English camp was quiet. The soldiers were hungry, sick, and cold. They confessed their sins, preparing for what they believed was their final day on earth. King Henry V walked among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement, reminding them of their past victories and the justice of their cause. He ordered silence, a stark contrast to the noisy French camp, creating an atmosphere of grim determination. The next morning, October 25th, the day of St. Crispin's Day, the two armies faced each other across a narrow, freshly plowed field, bordered on both sides by dense woods. The ground was a quagmire, soaked by days of heavy rain. This terrain, chosen by the French, would ironically become their greatest enemy. The French battle plan was a conventional, 3-wave cavalry and infantry charge. Their strength was their heavily armored knights, the medieval equivalent of tanks. They believed they could simply thunder across the field and smash the weak English line. Henry, on the other hand, had a plan born of desperation and a deep understanding of his army's strengths. His key asset was the English longbowmen. These were not peasants with hunting bows. They were professional soldiers who had trained from childhood. The English longbow was a fearsome weapon with a draw weight of over 100 pounds, capable of firing 10 to 12 arrows a minute. An arrow storm from thousands of these archers could pierce armor and create utter chaos. Henry positioned his small force of men-at-arms in the center and placed the vast majority of his archers on the flanks. Crucially, he had his archers hammer sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of them, creating a deadly, hidden fence to impale charging horses. For 3 hours, the armies stood facing each other in a tense standoff. The French were waiting for more troops to arrive, while the English were preserving their energy. Finally, Henry knew he had to act. He couldn't afford to wait. He gave the order to advance. His entire army moved forward, just within extreme longbow range, replanted their stakes, and prepared to receive the charge. This audacious move seemed to taunt the French, and they took the bait. The first French wave, a mix of cavalry and dismounted knights, began their ponderous advance. This is where everything started to go wrong for the French. As they charged, they were funneled into the narrow field, which became more and more congested. The deep, sticky mud clung to their heavy plate armor, which could weigh over 50 pounds. Each step was a monumental effort, sucking the energy from their legs. They were exhausted before they even reached the English line. Then, the sky went dark. A terrifying blizzard of arrows, tens of thousands of them, rained down on the advancing French. The bodkin-tipped arrows punched through the weaker points in their armor, wounding and killing men and, more importantly, their horses. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the mud and creating a tangled, writhing barrier of flesh and steel. The knights who were on foot stumbled over their fallen comrades, their vision obscured by their own helmets. The charge lost all momentum and cohesion, turning into a slow, disorganized slog through a killing field. When the survivors finally reached the English line, they were exhausted, disoriented, and packed so tightly together they could barely lift their arms to swing their weapons. The lightly armored English men-at-arms and archers, who dropped their bows and grabbed swords, axes, and mallets, met them head-on. A brutal, close-quarters melee ensued. The English, less encumbered by armor, had the advantage of mobility. They could move around the floundering French knights, striking at their joints and vulnerable spots. The sheer press of the second French wave, pushing from behind, only made the situation worse for their comrades at the front. Men were crushed and suffocated in the mud beneath the weight of their fallen comrades. The French nobility, who were supposed to be the decisive force, were being systematically slaughtered. The first French line was annihilated. The second wave advanced, only to meet the same fate. They had to clamber over a growing wall of their own dead and dying, all while being relentlessly targeted by the English archers. The attack faltered and broke. Within just a few hours, the mighty French army was shattered. The field was a horrific landscape of bodies piled several feet high. The English, in a state of disbelief, began taking thousands of prisoners. But the battle wasn't quite over. A moment of crisis occurred when a small French force attacked the lightly guarded English baggage train at the rear, a clear violation of the rules of war at the time. At the same moment, the remnants of the third French line appeared to be regrouping for another attack. Fearing he was about to be caught between two forces with thousands of high-value prisoners who could easily rearm themselves, Henry made a ruthless but militarily necessary decision. He ordered the execution of the French prisoners. It was a brutal act, but in the chaos of the moment, Henry believed it was the only way to secure his victory and save his own army from being overwhelmed. When the French saw the prisoners being killed, any remaining will to fight evaporated. The battle was over. The English had won an utterly staggering victory. English casualties were in the low hundreds, perhaps 400 at most. French losses were catastrophic. While exact numbers are debated, it's estimated that anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 French soldiers were killed, including the Constable of France himself and a huge portion of the French nobility. So how did it happen? It was a perfect storm of factors. French arrogance and overconfidence led them to make critical mistakes. The terrible weather and muddy terrain completely negated their advantage in heavy cavalry and armor. And finally, there was the brilliant leadership of Henry V and the devastating effectiveness of the English longbow. Agincourt wasn't just a battle. It was a tactical masterpiece and a testament to the idea that in warfare, it's not always the bigger army that wins. It's often the one that's better led, more disciplined, and can better adapt to the conditions on the ground. The story of that bloody day in northern France continues to inspire and fascinate us, a timeless lesson that even when faced with impossible odds, courage, strategy, and a little bit of mud can change the course of history. Thanks for watching. If you found this slice of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments what other legendary battles you'd like to see covered. See you next time.